The last hellish corner of eastern Aleppo. The UN believes more than 80 people have been shot in their homes, including women and children. Thousands more face intense bombardment from pro-government forces in the brutal end to this bloody war. So many are terrified and trapped, but still trying to tell the world what is going on in Syria.
I hope you can do something for Aleppo people, for my daughter, for the other children.
Also this lunchtime, we never thought he wouldn't come home. The teenager killed by NHS neglect, and the report that says investigations into such deaths are causing more suffering to bereaved families. The worst disruption for more than 20 years, the rail strike bringing the southern network to a halt. And how Santa was able to give a terminally ill child his final wish.
This is the ITV Lunchtime News with Nina Hussain.
Good afternoon. The world is watching the brutal, bloody end to the fighting in eastern Aleppo through the eyes of those trapped in their homes, terrified that they are just hours from death. Posting messages online which they fear could be their last, the UN says it is filled with foreboding for those who remain in this last hellish corner of the city. In the last hour, we are getting reports that more than 100 children are trapped in a building coming under heavy attack. The rebel forces against the Syrian government have held eastern Aleppo for more than 4 years, but their time has now run out. Juliet Bremner has the latest.
These are the last gasps of rebel-held Aleppo as the Syrian army and pro-government militias take control. The remaining civilians, doctors and fighters are hemmed into one small neighbourhood, desperately trying to get their voices heard.
The Assad militias are maybe 300 meters away. No place now to go. It's the last place.
Alhamdo is a teacher who has spoken out repeatedly in recent months and now fears this may be his last message.
Really, I don't know what to say, but I hope. I hope you can do something for Aleppo people, for my daughter, for the other children.
Another appeal comes from Lina.
This may be my last video. More than 50,000 of civilians who rebelled against the dictator al-Assad are threatened with field executions or dying under bombing.
As the bombardment continues, doctors in eastern Aleppo have told the United Nations up to 100 unaccompanied children are trapped in a building that's being attacked. At the UN headquarters in Switzerland, officials say they have reliable evidence that 82 civilians have been shot.
We've been receiving reports that many civilians have been detained by pro-government forces. We've also been informed that pro-government forces have been entering civilian homes and killing those individuals found inside, including women and children.
State-controlled television continues to show streams of people leaving Aleppo, but those trapped in the last rebel enclave say there's no way out. Hope of finding an escape route fades with each passing hour. Juliet Bremner, ITV News.
Our correspondent Dan Rivers is in Syria this lunchtime and on his way into Aleppo. He sent us the latest on the situation and how those trapped feel the world has let them down.
They feel they have been abandoned by the international community, that they have been forgotten, and that these atrocities are playing out without anyone attempting to intervene or stop the violence. The Syrian army says it now controls 98% of the city of Aleppo, and that really it just appears to be a matter of perhaps a few hours, maybe a few days at most, before those remaining 4 districts fall to the combination of the Syrian army and their allies, including Russia, which is providing air power, and Iran, which is providing some militia support in the city. This seems to be the kind of brutal conclusion to the battle for Aleppo that has raged for 4.5 years and will be a significant moment in the Syrian civil war. It's Syria's biggest city. It's the commercial hub of the country and will provide an enormous morale boost for President Assad as they now would control all of the major urban centres in the country.
Dan Rivers there from just outside Aleppo. Our political correspondent Libby Vina joins me now from Westminster. What is happening right now in Aleppo will be discussed by MPs here in an emergency debate in around 15 minutes' time.
Yes, well, the Defence Secretary, Michael Fallon, has already made it clear that he believes it's almost impossible to get airdrops into the city of Aleppo. Despite that, Andrew Mitchell, the former International Development Secretary, has called for this debate due to start any minute now because he believes that Britain could put more diplomatic pressure on President Assad and the Russians to allow a ceasefire that would enable civilians to be evacuated from Aleppo. Will this all just be more talk? Well, we'll find out when Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, sums up for the government at the end of the debate. We're told that the Cabinet discussed it this morning. The Prime Minister anxious to get a common position agreed by European leaders later this week in Brussels.
Libby Vina, thank you. Next this lunchtime, grieving families are not being listened to when the NHS investigates patient deaths, causing them even more suffering. That is the conclusion of a report by the health watchdog, the Care Quality Commission. It also criticised how some nurses and doctors treated families following a death, with one relative telling the Commission they had experienced more courtesy at a supermarket checkout. Sally Biddulph now on the families who've seen a lack of care and compassion firsthand.
She said, "You have to accept that his time has come. My son was just 34.
As soon as we started asking questions, it was like we were interfering.
They drip feed you information. They give you a tiny closed-off answer. They ignored us, lied to us and refused to send us minutes.
No one comes to you and says, this is what is going to happen.
I've had more courtesy at the supermarket checkout than I've had at the trust."
The words of relatives whose family members have died in hospital, seeking answers they never found and criticising the way they were treated. Today's report into how NHS trusts in England investigate patients' deaths is damning.
Very often families are not involved to the extent that they would want to be. That we are not doing the reviews and investigations to the quality that we should be, and trusts are not learning from those investigations, and importantly action is not being taken.
The review found that not a single NHS trust was getting it right, that hospitals were immediately on the defensive during the investigation process, and that there was a sense of inevitability when the person who died had a learning disability or mental illness. Responding in Parliament today, the Health Secretary said the report made sobering reading, announcing a number of measures to change the status quo.
We will ensure that investigations of any deaths that may be the result of problems in care are more thorough and genuinely involve families and carers. More broadly, instead of the patchwork approach that we currently have, all trusts will be asked to follow a standardised national framework for identifying potentially avoidable deaths, reviewing the care provided and learning from mistakes.
Losing a loved one is a personal tragedy, yet this report shows a scandal on a national scale of how bereaved relatives are treated by the NHS. Sally Biddulph, ITV News.
Well, Sarah Ryan is one of those bereaved parents. Her son Connor Sparrowhawk died when he was 18. While in the care of a unit run by Southern NHS Foundation Trust. Connor, who had autism, a learning disability and epilepsy, was found unconscious in the bath at Slade House in 2013. Serious neglect and failings contributed to his death, and an independent investigation found it could have been prevented. Also with me is the health campaigner Sharon Grant, who worked on a report 3 years ago into how patients' complaints are handled by the NHS. Thank you both for joining me. Sarah, if I can start with you. You've spoken before about the night that Connor died, your house became more of a campaigning centre than a home. 3 years on, are you angry or are you sad that nothing seems to have changed?
Weary. I feel really weary about it, and if we'd known 3.5 years ago that we'd be sitting here now talking about the sort of same sort of things, then I don't know what I'd have done at that point. Maybe we'd have just shut the door and not campaigned in the first place. I don't know.
Sharon, do you feel the same? Your report was published 3 years ago. It came after the mid-staff scandal. It came after everyone saying care has to be put back into the NHS. It has to be the focus. It has to be the priority, campaign after campaign. Why hasn't it worked?
Well, you're quite right. We had the Clwyd Hart report 3 years ago. We've had quite forensic examination by Health Watch England and by the Ombudsman of the whole complaint system. There have been select committee inquiries into the NHS complaint system, yet we still have the fact that we have a need for a further inquiry like this is of great concern. I mean, it should not take the heroic efforts of people like Sarah and other frustrated families to get an answer from the NHS in the case of a death, and particularly in the case where someone with learning disabilities is involved. This remains a huge concern and a real challenge to the whole culture of the NHS, that it seems to close ranks when it has criticism or whether there's a real complaint from a family.
Sharon, paying tribute to you there, Sarah. Jeremy Hunt did as well. We saw him briefly in that report. Do you think that when he says things will now change, this will now change, that will now happen?
No. I mean, we talk change all the time. I mean, until we see change, I won't believe it will happen. And I think you can say, well, I can assure you that this is going to happen. No, I can assure the British public that that's going to happen. They're utterly meaningless words until it does actually happen.
And when we're talking about somebody reporting to the Commission that they were treated with more courtesy at a supermarket checkout than when they were told that their relative was dying or had died, where do you begin if it's not coming from the Health Secretary and it's not going through to every ward and every nurse and every doctor? How is this going to change? Where do you begin?
I think, first of all, we need to have some serious independent support for families such as Sarah's when an incident like this happens. At the moment, it's very, very difficult for anybody to get independent support with which they can challenge what is quite an edifice in terms of NHS management and NHS profession. Families desperately need that support. I understand Sarah had to pass the hat round to raise money and to get legal advice in order to pursue this. And not every family has that determination and capacity to fight these battles. So that's the first thing we need to do. The second thing that we need to do, we need to have an independent element in an inquiry whenever there is a death around which there is a question. We cannot apparently rely on an NHS with a culture as it is to pursue a complaint with any integrity. There has to be an outside independent element in any inquiry into a questionable death.
The wish list seems very simple. Putting it into action seems much harder. Sharon and Sarah, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you. Southern Rail drivers have begun a 48-hour walkout, causing the UK's worst travel disruption in decades. More than 500,000 people from counties including Surrey and Sussex will be affected as rail workers strike over changes to their duties. It comes after months of industrial action and disruption on the line, which has led to some losing or leaving their jobs. Ivor Bennett now on how the dispute has left services at a standstill.
The departure board at Redhill Station this morning, with the words no commuter wants to see. From Brighton to Milton Keynes, Southampton to Ashford, stations are at a standstill. Well over 2,000 services cancelled, hundreds of thousands of people affected.
I can't actually go to work today. I've got to work from home now, so I actually can't go into work.
I pay so much for transport and I'm not getting enough out of it. I'm not getting my money's worth.
Passengers were advised not to travel at all, but many hadn't got the message, while others didn't have a choice, piling onto buses and other services instead. This is the latest in a long line of strikes to hit Southern's network, and lives have changed as a result. There are reports of cancer patients giving up therapy because of the disruption, while others have quit their jobs.
The trains here are terribly overcrowded. People are fainting on the trains every day, and it's just not really tolerable. So I decided, for my own peace of mind and lifestyle, to change my job, and many people here have done the same.
The dispute boils down to who operates the doors. Southern wants to introduce a driver-only operated service, which means they would open the doors instead of conductors. A third of Britain's rail services already operate that way, but unions say it's unsafe.
The reality for us is that the increasing length of trains, the increasing amount of footfall in the 21st century, we don't believe that the technology or the make, do and mend on our Victorian infrastructure lends itself to one-man operation.
But Southern insists no jobs will be lost, while the government's accused unions of being politically motivated.
We're not trying to remove guards from other services, we're just changing the nature of their jobs. No pay cuts, no loss of job security. So of course this is politically motivated. There's no excuse now for not getting around the table and sorting this out.
But at the moment, that seems some way off, with further strikes planned for the end of the week and January. Ivor Bennett, ITV News.
A tractor driver has been jailed for 16 months after running down and killing an 11-year-old boy. Gary Green was more than double over the legal alcohol limit for drivers when he knocked Harry Whitlam down with his tractor at a farm in Rothwell in West Yorkshire 3 years ago. Katie Oscroft has been in the court in Leeds. Take us through what you heard today.
Well, we heard today how Harry Whitlam came to be at the farm. He loved it there and he often went with his mum while she worked in the cafe. He liked playing with the animals and talking to the farm workers. Now that day, Gary Green had turned up for work after drinking heavily and late the night before. He started to reverse his tractor and trailer up the farmyard and didn't notice that the little boy was walking behind and he hit him. Now, the fact that this accident happened on private land meant that Gary Green was charged under health and safety laws and not with drink driving. Pamela Whitlam, Harry's mum, had spoke outside the court and had this to say.
Had this offence taken place on a public highway, in all likelihood, Mr Green would have received a custodial sentence of around 6 years. It is important because people have to learn and they've got to learn from somewhere. Drink driving shouldn't be allowed anywhere at any time.
Well, it emerged in court today that Gary Green had been prosecuted twice before for drink driving. Now, the judge here, Mr Justice Curl, said this accident could have and should have been avoided and was probably caused by the alcohol. Now, meanwhile, Pamela Whitlam is continuing to campaign for what she wants to call Harry's Law, tougher sentences in cases like these in memory of her son.
Katie Oscroft, thank you. Next, how the cost of living is back on the rise. Petrol and clothing were more expensive last month. Overall prices hit a 2-year high, growing 1.2% in November. It is the prolonged effect of the sharp fall in the value of the pound after the EU referendum. And experts say things are set to get worse. Our business editor Joel Hills is here. Take us through those figures then.
Well, it is all down to the weakness of the currency. We import far more than we export. So when a pound buys less, we end up paying more. We saw inflation in November rise to 1.2%. Now, the key thing to bear in mind here is that average pay is actually rising slightly above that level. So we're not feeling that yet, but we will. And here's why. Because the price of materials and fuel paid by manufacturers rose to 12.9% last month. Now, they cannot sit on these sorts of price increases. Some of them are going to get passed on.
Enjoy Christmas while it lasts because it's going to get more expensive. Inflation was never going to stay near zero forever. It was always going to pick up to about 2%. The problem is it's rising a little bit above that. It's not the highest we've ever seen. It would be a bear hug rather than a vice-like grip.
Down to the value of the pound. Is it all Brexit related?
Yes, mostly. I mean, look, there is a rise in the market price of oil, and when the price of oil rises, the price of everything rises. But that's been amplified, the impact of that's been amplified by the slump in the value of the pound, which looks pretty sustained since June. A year ago, we were talking about £1 at the pump, £1 a litre at the pump for petrol. Today, £1.14 and counting. The supermarket price war that we've benefited from in the last few years, that's coming to an end. 5 days ago, Poundland quietly but effectively dropped their commitment to everything for £1. A squeeze on living standards is on the way.
Joel, thank you. US President-elect Donald Trump has appointed oil tycoon Rex Tillerson as his Secretary of State. Mr. Tillerson is chief executive of ExxonMobil and soon to become the most senior diplomat in the United States. He's come under scrutiny for his close relationship with Russia's Vladimir Putin, but Trump's described him as the embodiment of the American dream. At this time of year, children all over the world are of course desperate to meet Santa, including a young boy in Tennessee in America. But the 6-year-old was terminally ill, and seeing Father Christmas was his dying wish. Santa made it in time, but the boy then broke his heart by dying in his arms. Helen Carter has the story.
There's no mistaking his chuckle, his beard and his stately paunch. But this year Christmas has been tough for Santa Claus.
I'm sorry.
Several weeks ago, Santa, who sometimes tries to go undercover as Eric Schmidt-Matson from Tennessee, was called to the bedside of a terminally ill 6-year-old boy. How do you even begin?
You have to start off with that jolly voice, that kind of stuff, Since, what's this I hear you're going to be missing Christmas this year? Yeah, they tell me I'm dying. Really? Well, you're not going to miss Christmas. Y'all's already had your present already made. We knew you wanted this for a long time. And he's like, really? Yeah, sure. And I got it right here for you, and brought it up to him, and he could barely unwrap it, So I helped him.
Santa gave the boy a toy and offered him these words.
When you get up those pearly gates, you just tell him you're Santa's #1 elf. He's like, I am? You sure are. They'll let you in I'm sure they'll let you right in. He goes, they will? I said, I know it. So he just came up and he gave me a big hug. I had hold of him and he just kind of looked up at me and he says, Santa, can you help me? And that's when he passed.
He gave the one gift he could, Christmas.
What do you want for Christmas?
Now he's determined to do the same for every other child. Helena Carter, ITV News.
That's it this lunchtime. Alistair Stewart and Mary Nightingale will be here at 6:30 with the ITV Evening News. From everyone here for now, bye-bye.